I think the great comparative investigators of religion, Mircea Eliade, probably foremost among them. He was part of Jung's broad school, and maybe played a role equivalent to that of Jung. They certainly identified the same kind of patterns in profound religious thinking that you can see characterizing literature. I mean, literature, stories are identifiable because they are manifestations of an underlying pattern.
Yes.
And I think you can make that case in the religious domain. I would make that case biologically, in part by, this is the way I conceptualize it, is that there's a virtually infinite number of ways that you can interact with someone. But there's a finite number of ways, extremely restricted and finite number of ways that you can interact with someone in a manner they and you approve of simultaneously.
Like a father, right? Like a parent, right?
Yeah, or two kids playing a game. Now, see, Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, he thought of that as the origin of morality. And Piaget's goal was actually a rapprochement between science and religion. And he looked at play as the origin of that in part. That was very, very smart. Okay, so now there's many ways that we can interact.
Yeah.
Some of them will jointly appreciate. Okay, in consequence of that appreciation, we'll want to continue them. That's the establishment of a relationship. Okay, so now imagine there's a smaller subset of those games that will maintain their value across time and stay voluntarily desirable or improve. Now that's an even smaller number of potential games. Well, those games are going to have a pattern. And it's the pattern of human interaction, sustainable human interaction. My suspicion is that conscience as an instinct indicates a violation of the rules of that game. And I suspect further that that's universal. Now, out of that, a realm of story is going to emerge. There's going to be representations of games that deteriorate and games that have a tragic end and games that are sustainable where everyone lives happily ever after.
And those games.
Those are going to have a universality across cultures. Now, cultures are going to vary in the sophistication with which they represent those games. But there's it's sort of like, it's almost like making the same claim that obviously all languages are the same because they're identifiable as languages and they're
structured.
And they're characteristic of human beings. But within the family of languages, there's commonality still, grammatical structure, there's nouns and verbs, like there's tremendous commonality, but there's also tremendous variability.
Yes.
So I think that religious domain is analogous to that. My sense, I've done a fair bit of study of comparative religion, is my sense that in the Judeo-Christian endeavor proceeded farther along the line of explicit representation than any other religious system. Now, we could debate that, but, that's not much different than saying that Western cultures are the most literate, which is that's the case.
Yeah, that's a fact.
So, yeah, definitely. And the Jews got there early.
Yeah, and I always say, we have the Eskimos and, in northern Canada reputed to have 12 words for snow. And you find that with the Jews. You find there's 6 different types of words for knowledge and wisdom and intuition and you can identify them. They don't have as many words for snow. And so what were their what was their environment like? It was saturated with religion. And
with literacy.
Yeah, and with literacy and the language and being able to communicate that as well, but also expressing something which must be intrinsic. And I find when I hosted Richard Dawkins in Vancouver, he had asked me to come up. I had him on my podcast for 2 episodes for his most recent book. And I'm always, and I've had Sam Harris on the last year as well. And the thing that's frustrating to me about when I talk to scientists like them is how simple their understanding is, quite frankly, of religion, specifically Judeo-Christian. I'm not an expert in anything. I mean, I was an altar boy in the Catholic Church as a kid, a complicated story, but I'm born Jewish, 2 Jewish parents, and I'm Jewish to this day. But the point, their understanding of things, like I said to Richard, in Vancouver, 1,000 people there, it was wonderful. People coming up, tears in their eyes, thank you for making me an atheist. And I found it so depressing. And because of the richness, and by the way, I often call myself a practicing agnostic, meaning, and which I think is in harmony with your famous statement that I mentioned before. In other words, if you know for sure that God exists, then you're an absolute fool or an imbecile if you don't believe in him or whatever that means, almost to the point of evidence. And I don't dispute that many Christians feel it in a way that Jews don't, this personal relationship with God, the Savior, and that he died for my sins. It's harder for Jews to relate to that. But I stipulate that they feel that way. But to say that you are an atheist, like that is your identity, is a very strange thing to me to believe, especially from these brilliant men like Sam and like Richard, because they have such simplistic ideas.
Well, the
knowledge.
thing that's odd about Sam too, in that regard, is that like he's drifted into a kind of a visionary Buddhism.
Yeah.
And I think I understand why. Like one of the characteristics of the meditative tradition that Sam is partaking in is that the God of that meditative tradition is extraordinarily ineffable, not defined and also not concretized into ritual or story.
Practice.
Now, the advantage to that is that you can't criticize it intellectually.
Can't falsify it, right?
Well, that's exactly right.
Exactly.
And I see that in the Christian tradition, the Orthodox Church has been the most resistant to woke idiocy, partly because it's so embedded in non-propositional tradition. Right, liturgy and ritual that, well, how are you going to criticize? It's like criticizing dance, like you're just, or music. You're just not going to get anywhere with it.
The taste is not indisputable, right? I said to Richard, I said, look, Richard, I also don't believe in the God that you also don't believe in.
Right.
It's so simplistic. And Sam, to some extent, is worse, just from the perspective that he's so persuasive. I mean, he's the only person besides you that I've ever known, I've spent 4 hours with, that never uses the word has any verbal crutches whatsoever. And I don't mean to jinx our conversation, but he just speaks he speaks in prose, as they say, paragraphs. And when we talk about things, very simple things, why don't you do, what is your feeling about Judaism that made you reject, I guess his dad is Jewish, I forget. Just take slavery. And he just asserts that, slavery there's no such thing. If he said to me, Brian, you and I create a religion. Are we going to have slavery in it? I said, Sam, this is like my 7-year-old learns this, in school, in her Talmud class. Like, you can't be serious. Like, you think that slavery meant like black African slave trade, in the deep South in America. And it's just not that. And so we go through it, and I taught him, what it meant to have a slave. By the way, Moses is called a slave of God. Did that mean that Moses was whipped by God? No, it means he was a servant. And there was this concept called indentured servitude, which is actually a kindness. If you couldn't pay your debt to me, Jordan, and you were going to steal something, no, I would give you, basically employ you, and I'd provide food and shelter. And by the way, sometimes you wouldn't want to leave. After 6 years, you wouldn't want to leave because I treated you so well as my slave that I would have to take your ear and hammer it into the door with a nail. And this was a part of a tradition that Jewish slaves had to undergo in order to remain with their masters, because we're meant to be free. And so this was meant to show as an outward symbol to the world that I chose not to be free. And we know many people choose to be slaves of a different kind rather than be free men and women. But I said, idea about this. And I said,
it's also the case that, first of all, the entire story of Exodus is about the movement from slavery and tyranny to freedom.
Right.
So, and that's that's a major part of the biblical library. And then, even more importantly, the metaphysical insistence is that if you're not a slave to God, let's say, so to speak, there's something that you're a slave to.
You might be a slave to yourself.
And that's not appropriate. Or a slave to your whims.
Your work.
And that's what hedonistic self-gratification is. It's like, I'm free. It's like, no, you're not. You're a slave to your whims.
The most common slavery that scientists practice is workaholism. They work 24/7. They work all days of the week. They're so fascinated because it's so intoxicating. You have that feeling when you discover something and you realize, wow, gee, I am the first frail human that's ever understood this. in the history of the planet. It might be small, it might be incremental, maybe it's not.
Yeah, but you also don't know.
But you don't know, and you don't know what these little seeds.
Hot on the trail, man.
Yeah, you may blossom into something so wonderful, and that's what's so great about science. But it's addictive, and I tell my students, you have to work. But people forget, Jordan, right? Before it says, on the seventh day you shall rest, it says 6 days you must work. In other words, it's not optional; it's a command. It's a mitzvah, command form. Hebrew has, English doesn't. You must work, Jordan, because you can't appreciate the true sense of soul society, nefesh, satiating of your soul, unless you have that feeling of accomplishment of working the earth or working in the laboratory.
Right.
But
You
if you
won't have a
only do that,
vacation.
you're a slave. I don't care. You might have a Nobel Prize, but you're a slave.